Bloodstains on a rusted porch are notoriously hard to wash away, especially when they belong to something not quite human. Most residents of Oak Haven dismissed Beatrice Miller as a broken, rejected woman losing her mind in the deep Oregon woods. They whispered about her late-night rituals and the strange, scarred creature she nursed back to health in a repurposed glass terrarium. What they didn't know was that her fragile little patient ruled a hidden empire in the shadows. Deep within the damp emerald embrace of the Deschutes National Forest, the town of Oak Haven, Oregon existed as a tight-knit community where secrets were currency and reputations were fragile. Beatrice Miller had learned this the hard way. A year ago, she was the town's golden girl, managing the local branch of the U.S. Bank, and engaged to Caleb Weston, a charismatic real estate developer whose family owned half the commercial properties on Main Street. Her life had been a meticulously planned itinerary of success and domestic bliss. That was until the night of her rehearsal dinner, when an accidental pocket dial broadcasted Caleb and Beatrice's younger sister Abigail in a highly compromising situation in the courtroom of the Oak Haven Country Club. The betrayal was absolute, tearing her family and her future apart in a single evening. When Beatrice reacted with justifiable rage, throwing a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon in Caleb's face and overturning the head table, the conservative town inexplicably turned against her. They labeled her hysterical, unhinged, and dramatic. Caleb, with his wealth and local influence, easily spun the narrative. He married Abigail 3 months later. Beatrice was quietly let go from her position at the bank and retreated to an inherited, dilapidated cabin off Highway 97, a sprawling 50-acre property of dense timberland that Caleb desperately wanted but couldn't touch. Beatrice became the village pariah. She only ventured into town for essentials, pulling her wool coat tight around her shoulders to shield herself from the heavy Pacific Northwest rain and the equally cold stares of her former neighbors. She worked remote data entry jobs to pay her property taxes, living a quiet, ghost-like existence. Her only company was the relentless wind howling through the Douglas firs and the creeping darkness of the isolated woods. It happened on a Tuesday in late October, during one of the worst torrential downpours the county had seen in a decade. Beatrice was sitting by her wood-burning stove, wrapping her hands around a chipped mug of Earl Grey tea, when she heard a heavy, wet thud against her reinforced glass sliding door. It wasn't the erratic tapping of a branch. It sounded like a sack of wet sand. Heart pounding, she grabbed a heavy cast-iron fire poker and crept toward the back porch. She flipped the exterior floodlights. Under the harsh yellow glare, amidst a puddle of rainwater and dark viscous liquid, lay a creature. At first she thought it was a large raven, or perhaps a stray dog, mangled by a coyote, but as she cracked the door open, the metallic scent of blood hit her strong and undeniable. She stepped out into the freezing rain. It was a bat, but of a size that defied logic. It was easily the size of a large eagle, with leathery wings that looked to be over 5 feet across when extended. Its fur was midnight black, tipped with a strange luminescent silver that seemed to catch the sparse light. One of its massive wings was pinned awkwardly beneath it, torn to shreds, exposing bone and muscle. Deep, jagged claw marks, too large to belong to any local predator, raked across its back. The creature was dying. Its chest heaved with shallow, rattling breaths. Beatrice should have called animal control. She should have gone back inside and locked the door. Bats were vectors for rabies. A creature this size was practically a monster. But as she looked down at the broken, bleeding thing, a profound sense of empathy washed over her. It was alone, rejected by the safety of the night, left to die in the cold. She knew exactly how that felt. "Okay," Beatrice whispered into the storm, dropping the fire poker. "Okay, let's get you inside." She fetched an old wool blanket from the mudroom, carefully wrapping the massive creature. It hissed a sound like grinding stones and weakly bared a set of needle-sharp, impossibly long fangs, but it lacked the strength to fight. Beatrice carried the heavy burden into her living room, placing it inside a large, empty glass terrarium she had once used for an iguana. She spent the next 3 hours acting as a makeshift veterinarian. Using a first aid kit, she cleaned the deep lacerations with iodine. The bat watched her. That was the most unsettling part. Its eyes were not the beady, unseeing voids of a typical animal. They were a deep, mesmerizing crimson, and they tracked her every movement with sharp, piercing intelligence. It didn't panic. It simply observed her as she expertly bandaged its torn wing with gauze and medical tape. When the bleeding finally stopped, Beatrice collapsed into her armchair, exhausted. She looked at the terrarium. The creature was resting its massive silver-tipped wings, folded as best as the bandages would allow. "I guess it's just you and me now," she murmured into the quiet cabin. The crimson eyes slowly blinked in the shadows. Keeping a creature of unknown origin alive in a secluded cabin proved to be a daunting task. Beatrice spent her first morning scouring the internet using a spotty satellite connection, trying to identify the species. It vaguely resembled a Malayan flying fox, but the geographical impossibility, the silver-tipped fur, and the sheer carnivorous dentition completely contradicted that theory. Fruit bats did not have fangs designed to tear through thick hide. She quickly learned that the creature had zero interest in the sliced apples or berries she offered. It turned its head away in disdain. It was only when Beatrice was preparing her own dinner, thawing a package of raw ground beef from the local Safeway, that the creature reacted. A low, vibrating purr, almost like a large feline, emanated from the glass tank. The bat pressed its snout against the glass, its crimson eyes locked onto the bloody plastic wrapping on the kitchen counter. "You want meat?" Beatrice asked, feeling a chill run down her spine. She took a pair of long tongs, grabbed a clump of raw beef, and slowly lowered it into the terrarium. The bat struck with lightning speed. It didn't nibble. It devoured the meat in seconds, its powerful jaws making quick work of the offering. From that day on, Beatrice's routine drastically changed. She became a frequent customer at Hank's Custom Meats in the neighboring town of Redmond, buying pounds of raw liver, prime cuts of steak, and asking for whatever scrap blood the butcher was willing to part with. Hank, a burly man with a thick mustache, eyed her suspiciously. "Got a new dog out there in the woods, B?" Hank asked one afternoon, ringing up 3 pounds of raw venison scraps. "Something like that," Beatrice replied with a tight, polite smile. "A rescue needs building up. Well, keep it tied up. Sheriff's been getting calls about livestock out near the county line being torn up. Something big roaming the woods." Beatrice's stomach dropped, but she maintained her composure, paying in cash and hurrying back to her rusted Subaru Outback. Her patient hadn't left her living room, but the mention of a predator made her hyper-aware of the strange reality she was living in. The bond between Beatrice and the creature deepened over the next 3 weeks. The bat was healing at a miraculous, almost terrifying rate. The deep gouges on its back knit together, leaving behind faint silvery scars. Beatrice found herself talking to it during the long, lonely evenings. She poured out her soul to the silent listener, something she hadn't done since the betrayal. She told the creature about Caleb's cold cruelty, about Abigail's smug smile at the altar, and how the entire town of Oak Haven had treated her like a diseased branch that needed to be pruned. They didn't even care about the truth, Beatrice whispered one night, sitting cross-legged in front of the terrarium, holding a glass of cheap Merlot. "Caleb has the money, so Caleb gets to dictate reality. And now he wants this land. He keeps sending letters from his lawyers at Pearson and Cole. He wants to bulldoze these woods to build a luxury eco-resort." The bat let out a low rumbling hiss at the mention of Caleb's name. Its crimson eyes seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity, locking onto Beatrice's face. It was as if it understood every word, every ounce of her lingering heartbreak and rising anger. The true turning point in their bizarre relationship occurred on a Tuesday night. Beatrice was attempting to open a stubborn tin of Campbell's soup for her own dinner. The metal pull tab snapped, leaving a jagged edge of aluminum. As she tried to pry it open with a butter knife, her hand slipped. The sharp metal sliced deep into the pad of her index finger. "Damn it!" she hissed immediately, drawing her hand back. Blood welled up instantly, thick and bright red, dripping onto the linoleum floor. Before she could grab a paper towel, a frantic scratching sound erupted from the living room. Beatrice walked over, wrapping her bleeding finger in a napkin. The bat was agitated, pacing the length of the terrarium, its wings flared. It wasn't looking at her face. It was staring obsessively at her injured hand. The scent of her blood had sent it into a frenzy. Curiosity tinged with a strange, dark compulsion overtook Beatrice. She remembered the sheer intelligence in those red eyes. She slowly unwrapped the napkin from her finger. She opened the mesh lid of the terrarium. She didn't use the tongs. She extended her bare, bleeding hand down into the enclosure. "Here," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bat froze. It slowly crept forward, its massive claws clicking gently against the glass bottom. It didn't attack. Instead, it lowered its head, opening its terrifying jaws. A long, dark tongue extended, and it gently, almost reverently, began to lick the blood from Beatrice's finger. The sensation was electric. A sudden, shocking wave of cold energy rushed up Beatrice's arm, making her gasp. The creature's saliva acted as a natural anesthetic. The stinging pain in her cut vanished instantly. As the bat fed on those few drops of her blood, it looked up at her. In that moment, the barrier between human and animal shattered completely. Beatrice wasn't looking at a beast. She was looking at something ancient, aware, and incredibly powerful. When it finished, the bat gently nudged her palm with its cold, leathery snout, a gesture of profound gratitude. From that night on, the terrarium remained open. The creature chose not to leave. It roosted in the dark rafters of her high-ceilinged cabin, acting as a silent, vigilant guardian over the rejected village girl. Winter arrived in Oakhaven with a brutal vengeance. Snow piled high against the windows of the cabin, isolating Beatrice even further from the town that had shunned her. Her secret companion, whom she had silently taken to calling Shadow, in her mind grew stronger every day. The torn wing had healed perfectly, the leathery membrane completely restored, yet it remained inside, hanging upside down from the heavy oak beams above her bed, watching her sleep. The fragile piece was violently shattered 2 days before Christmas. Beatrice was chopping firewood on the back porch when she heard the distinct aggressive crunch of heavy tires on her unplowed gravel driveway. A sleek black Ford F-150 pulled up aggressively, throwing snow onto her frozen flower beds. Caleb Weston stepped out. He was dressed in a pristine, expensive wool overcoat, his jaw set in a hard, arrogant line. Accompanying him was a man Beatrice recognized as Arthur Vance, no Arthur Pendleton, Caleb's ruthless property lawyer from Portland. "Beatrice," Caleb called out, his voice dripping with condescension as he marched up the porch steps. "You're making this incredibly difficult. You haven't answered your phone in weeks." Beatrice gripped the handle of her splitting axe, her knuckles turning white. "You're trespassing, Caleb. I told you I'm not selling." "You don't have a choice anymore, B," Caleb said smoothly, stepping onto the porch. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his coat. "My legal team found a loophole in your grandfather's trust at Wells Fargo. You haven't maintained the property to the county zoning standards. The town council, Mayor Higgins included, has agreed to issue an eminent domain order if you don't sign this buyout agreement." "That's a lie," Beatrice spat, stepping forward. "You bought Higgins off. This is my home." Caleb sneered, his charming facade dropping to reveal the cruel man underneath. He stepped into her personal space, towering over her. "You are a crazy, isolated spinster living in a shack, Beatrice. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed your family. Take the money, sign the deed, and leave Oregon. If you don't, I will have the sheriff forcibly evict you by Friday. You'll leave with nothing." He reached out violently, grabbing Beatrice by the upper arm to force the pen and envelope into her hand. A sound erupted from inside the cabin that froze the blood in Beatrice's veins. It wasn't an animal screech. It was a roar of absolute demonic fury that rattled the frost-covered windows. Caleb jumped back, dropping Beatrice's arm. "What the hell is that?" Before Beatrice could answer, the reinforced glass of the sliding door shattered outward in an explosion explosion of glittering shards. A massive black blur launched itself from the shadows of the living room. Caleb screamed as massive claws raked across the hood of his expensive truck, tearing through the metal like wet tissue paper. The giant bat landed on the roof of the Ford, its wings fully extended, casting a monstrous shadow over the two men. It bared its fangs, letting out a deafening sonic hiss that forced Caleb and his lawyer to cover their ears in agony. "Shoot it! Shoot it!" Pendleton yelled, scrambling backward into the snow. Caleb didn't have a gun. He scrambled into the driver's seat, throwing the truck into reverse. The tires spun wildly in the snow before catching, and the truck tore down the driveway, nearly sliding into a ditch in their desperate escape. The bat remained perched on the porch railing for a long moment, watching the road. Then it turned its crimson eyes to Beatrice. The anger vanished, replaced by a strange, calm intensity. It hopped down, walking awkwardly on its folded wings through the broken glass, and retreated into the dark cabin. Beatrice spent the rest of the evening boarding up the broken door with plywood and shivering by the fire. The adrenaline crash left her exhausted and terrified. Caleb would return. He would bring the sheriff. Her life in Oak Haven was truly over. She fell into a restless sleep on the living room sofa, huddled under 3 blankets, the fire slowly dying into glowing embers. Sometime past midnight, the temperature in the room plummeted. The silence was absolute. Even the wind outside had stopped howling. Beatrice jolted awake, a primal instinct warning her that she was no longer alone. She looked up toward the rafters. The bat was gone. Panic flared in her chest. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chin. "Shadow," she whispered into the dark. "A rather simplistic name, but I suppose it served its purpose." The voice did not come from the rafters. It came from the armchair in the corner of the room. It was a man's voice, deep, resonant, and impossibly smooth, carrying a subtle, aristocratic accent that commanded instant obedience. Beatrice scrambled backward on the sofa, reaching blindly for the fire poker she kept on the coffee table. "Who's there? How did you get in here?" "Peace, Beatrice. I mean you no harm. In fact, I owe you my life." The man leaned forward into the dim orange glow of the dying firelight. Beatrice's breath hitched in her throat. He was strikingly, almost painfully handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features carved from pale marble. His hair was jet black, falling in elegant waves around his face, streaked with the exact luminescent silver of the bat's fur. He was tall, powerfully built, and dressed in clothing that seemed woven from the very shadows of the room, a dark, tailored suit that looked simultaneously ancient and impeccably modern. But it was his eyes that gave him away. They were a brilliant, terrifying crimson red. "You," Beatrice stammered, dropping the poker. "You're the—" "Yes," the man said softly, standing up. He moved with a liquid, predatory grace that was mesmerizing to watch. "My name is Valerius Croft, and for the last month you have fed me, sheltered me, and bled for me when my own kind betrayed me and trapped me in that wretched form." Valerius walked slowly toward the sofa. Beatrice was paralyzed, caught between profound terror and an inexplicable magnetic pull toward him. "The poison in my veins required human blood willingly given to break the curse," Valerius explained, stopping just inches from her. He reached out his cool, pale fingers, gently tracing the faint scar on her index finger where she had cut herself on the soup can. "You gave me that gift. You, a woman cast aside by her own people, showed mercy to a monster." He knelt before her, bringing his face level with hers. The power radiating from him was intoxicating. "Caleb Weston and his petty mortal grievances are no longer your concern," Valerius whispered, his crimson eyes locking onto hers, seeing every hidden desire and past trauma. "You cared for a king in his weakest hour, Beatrice Miller, and a king always repays his debts." Silence reigned in the freezing cabin, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the crackle of the dying embers. Beatrice stared at the immortal being kneeling before her. Valerius possessed a terrifying magnetic beauty, but it was the absolute authority in his crimson eyes that held her paralyzed. This was no mere creature of the night. This was an apex predator who had conquered centuries. You speak of debts, Beatrice finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands trembling as she pulled the woven blanket tighter around her shoulders. I didn't save you for a reward. I saved you because you were broken, and I know what it feels like to be discarded. Valerius stood slowly, towering over her. He reached out his cool, marble-like fingers, gently lifting her chin. And that is precisely why your enemies will learn the true meaning of ruin. The Western family believes they hold power in this pitiful logging town. They are about to discover how remarkably fragile mortal empires truly are. He turned away, moving toward the boarded-up sliding door with that unnatural liquid grace. He placed a single hand against the heavy plywood she had meticulously nailed into place. With a terrifyingly casual flick of his wrist, the wood splintered into 100 pieces, exploding outward into the snow. The freezing winter wind howled into the living room, but Valerius didn't seem to notice the cold. We must leave, Valerius commanded, his tone leaving no room for debate. My magical signature was masked while I was trapped in my beast form. Now that I have shifted, the usurpers who poisoned me will sense my awakening. Furthermore, the local authorities, bought and paid for by your former fiancé, will arrive at dawn with eviction notices and armed deputies. Beatrice panicked. Leave, this is my home. It's all I have left. It is a wooden box surrounded by wolves, Valerius corrected smoothly. He turned to face her, his expression softening just a fraction. You are under the protection of the sovereign of the Cascades now. I will not allow you to be caged or humiliated any longer. Pack only what holds sentimental value, the rest can be replaced. He pulled a sleek midnight black smartphone from the inner pocket of his suit, a customized, encrypted device that looked entirely out of place in her rustic cabin. He dialed a number, speaking in a rapid, fluid language that sounded like a harsh, beautiful blend of ancient Latin and something far older. Within 20 minutes, the deafening roar of a high-performance engine cut through the blizzard. A matte black Mercedes-Benz G63 AMG tore up the snowy driveway, its heavy tires crushing the ice with ease. Two men stepped out. They moved with the same predatory stillness as Valerius. They were dressed in immaculate tactical winter gear, their eyes hidden behind dark aviator sunglasses despite the dead of night. "My lord," the taller of the two said, bowing deeply at the waist as he approached the shattered doorway. "The perimeter is secure. The council believes you perished in the Bitterroot Mountain ambush. Let them enjoy their false victory for a few more hours, Gideon," Valerius replied coldly. He looked back at Beatrice, who was standing numbly in the center of the room, clutching a small duffel bag containing her mother's jewelry and a few changes of clothes. Valerius extended his hand to her. "Walk out of this tomb, Beatrice. You will never have to hide in the shadows again." Taking a deep breath, she placed her hand in his. His skin was cold, but the energy humming beneath it was undeniable. As he led her to the waiting armored SUV, she didn't look back at the ruined cabin. For the first time in a year, the crushing weight of Oakhaven's judgment lifted from her shoulders, replaced by the terrifying, exhilarating reality of the immortal world she was stepping into. The drive took hours, winding through the treacherous, ice-slicked roads of the Mount Hood National Forest before descending into the Columbia River Gorge. Beatrice fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep against the plush leather seats of the Mercedes, lulled by the heated interior and the smooth, silent speed of the vehicle. When she awoke, the sun was hidden behind a thick, impenetrable blanket of gray Pacific Northwest clouds. The SUV was pulling up to a pair of massive wrought iron gates bearing a complex crest of a wolf and a bat intertwined. The gates silently swung open, revealing a private winding road lined with ancient towering redwoods. At the end of the road sat an architectural marvel. It was a sprawling estate built directly into the side of a sheer cliff face, overlooking the turbulent waters of the Columbia River. It married the rugged stone aesthetics of a historic fortress with the sweeping floor-to-ceiling glass windows of ultra-modern luxury design. "Welcome to the Eyrie," Valerius said quietly beside her. As they stepped inside, Beatrice was immediately overwhelmed by the sheer opulence. The grand foyer featured a magnificent chandelier crafted from hundreds of jagged raw quartz crystals. Original Renaissance paintings lined the walls, and the floors were polished black marble. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the rusted porch and wood-burning stove of her former life. A small army of staff, some human, some with the distinct pale stillness of vampires, moved efficiently through the halls. Valerius was immediately swarmed by his inner circle, his loyalists who had been secretly holding his empire together during his month-long disappearance. "Take her to the East Wing," Valerius instructed, a severe-looking woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair. "Provide her with everything she requires. Contact the boutique in Portland, have an entire wardrobe brought here by this evening. Spare no expense." For the next 3 days, Beatrice was treated with a level of deference and luxury she couldn't have imagined. She was given a suite larger than her entire cabin, complete with a sunken soaking tub overlooking the gorge, and a closet rapidly filling with garments from Oscar de la Renta, Alexander McQueen, and custom-tailored silks. But beneath the luxury, the tension in the estate was palpable. Beatrice learned through quiet observations and hushed conversations with the staff the political reality of her new protector. Valerius was the undisputed alpha king of the Pacific Northwest territories, controlling a vast network of wealth, real estate, and immortal politics. A month prior, a splinter faction led by the Montgomery Coven, a wealthy old-money vampire family operating out of Seattle, had ambushed him. They used a rare alchemical silver ash poison to lock him in his transitional beast form, leaving him to die in the Oregon woods. On the 4th evening, Valerius summoned Beatrice to his private study. The room was lined with thousands of leather-bound books and smelled of rich mahogany and aged scotch. Valerius stood by the massive window, looking out at the rain lashing against the glass. "The Montgomery faction has called a summit in Seattle," Valerius said without turning around. "They plan to formally declare my death and seize my holdings, billions in assets managed through shell companies at JP Morgan Chase and BlackRock." "What will you do?" Beatrice asked, stepping further into the room. She was wearing a stunning tailored emerald green dress. The staff had provided her confidence, slowly returning as the trauma of Oakhaven faded. Valerius finally turned his crimson eyes, locking onto hers with a dark, predatory amusement. "I will attend their summit, of course, and I want you by my side." Beatrice hesitated. "Me, I'm just a human. I'll be a target." "You are the woman who saved the king," Valerius corrected, smoothly crossing the room to stand before her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box. Inside rested a breathtaking necklace, a heavy platinum chain holding a massive, flawless teardrop, ruby surrounded by black diamonds. It looked centuries old. "This is the sovereign's tear," he murmured gently, fastening the cold metal around her neck. It rested heavily against her collarbone, warm against her skin. "Wearing this signifies that you are under my absolute unbreakable protection. Anyone who looks at you with disrespect, anyone who dares to threaten you will answer to me. You are no longer the rejected village girl, Beatrice. You are the architect of my return, and it is time to show the world your power." Before confronting the immortal traitors, Valerius turned his terrifying intellect toward the mortals who had sought to destroy Beatrice. He understood that true revenge wasn't simply physical violence. It was the systematic dismantling of a person's pride, legacy, and security. The Western real estate empire, managed by her treacherous former fiancé, was heavily leveraged. They owned half of Oakhaven, but their wealth was built on loans, credit lines, and the illusion of invulnerability. Valerius deployed his financial fixers, a ruthless group of corporate lawyers based out of a high-rise in downtown Portland. It began on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Beatrice had fled her cabin. The Western heir walked into his lavish office on Main Street, expecting a routine day of bullying local business owners and finalizing the demolition orders for Beatrice's property. Instead, his secretary was pale trembling as she handed him a stack of urgent legal notices. "Sir, the bank just called," she stammered. "All of our credit lines at US Bank have been frozen." He snatched the papers, his arrogant face twisting in confusion and growing panic. Overnight, a shadow holding company had aggressively bought up all of Western Development's outstanding debt. Every mortgage, every construction loan, every promissory note was suddenly called in. The grace periods were brutally revoked due to obscure buried clauses in the original contracts that Valerius's legal team had weaponized. By noon, the situation escalated. The town council of Oakhaven, including the corrupt Mayor Higgins, received emergency audits from the state tax board, prompted by anonymous, incredibly detailed whistleblower packets outlining their embezzlement and backroom deals. At 2 p.m., the Western heir's phone rang. It was his treacherous new wife, Beatrice's sister, screaming hysterically, "Our black cards are declining. I'm at Neiman Marcus, and they just cut the cards in front of me. What is happening?" He couldn't answer. He was staring out his office window as a fleet of black town cars pulled up to the local courthouse. Men in sharp suits carrying thick briefcases marched inside. The corporate slaughter had begun. Back at the airy Valerius, and Beatrice watched the collapse unfold on a massive multi-monitor display in the estate's tactical room. Beatrice watched the live feeds of stock plummets and property seizures with a mixture of awe and cold satisfaction. "They built their kingdom on sand," Valerius murmured, standing close behind her, his hand resting lightly on the back of her leather chair. "And you, my dear, are the tide." "He wanted my 50 acres, Beatrice said softly, staring at a news alert detailing the sudden bankruptcy filing of Western Development. "He destroyed my reputation over 50 acres of timberland. By tomorrow morning you will own every commercial building he ever touched," Valerius stated matter-of-factly. "The deed to his own house will be placed in a trust under your name. You can bulldoze his manicured lawns and plant a forest if you wish." Beatrice looked up at him, her heart pounding. The poetic justice was absolute, a hard, undeniable karma that no mortal court could ever deliver. The people who had called her crazy, who had cast her into the woods to freeze, were currently experiencing a total devastating loss of everything they valued. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me yet," Valerius replied, his crimson eyes flashing with a dangerous, thrilling light as he looked away from the monitors and down at her. "The mortal trash has been swept away. Now we must travel to Seattle. It is time for the king to reclaim his throne from the Montgomery cowards. And I promise you, Beatrice, the violence of the boardroom will pale in comparison to what I am going to do to them." The transition from the rusted, drafty confines of her forest cabin to the pinnacle of immortal high society felt less like a dream and more like a profound, high-stakes rebirth. As the sleek, matte black motorcade sped away from the cliffside eyrie and toward the private airstrip, Beatrice felt the lingering ghosts of Oakhaven, the whispering neighbors, her former fiancé's sneers, her sister's betrayal stripping away in the cold Pacific wind. She was no longer the broken, rejected village girl. She was the weapon forged in their cruelty, and she was seated beside the apex predator of the Pacific Northwest. The journey to Seattle was a masterclass in untouchable wealth. They bypassed commercial terminals, entirely boarding a private Gulfstream G650ER, waiting on the rain-slicked tarmac of Portland International Airport. The jet's interior was a study in aggressive luxury, dark walnut paneling, white leather seats, and soft ambient lighting that catered to the sensitive eyes of its immortal owner. Valerius Davenport sat across from Beatrice, a crystal tumbler of aged scotch in one hand, his crimson eyes reflecting the faint runway lights as the aircraft banked north toward Washington. He had traded his ancient-looking suit for a modern, impeccably tailored charcoal Tom Ford ensemble that made him look like a ruthless Wall Street executive were it not for the terrifying predatory stillness of his posture. "The Montgomery faction operates differently than the brutes I eliminated in the past," Valerius explained, his deep voice easily cutting through the low hum of the jet engines. "They do not rely solely on fangs and physical dominance. They are venture capitalists, parasites who drain the lifeblood of the mortal economy through a web of shadow corporations. Their primary front is Rainier Apex Capital. They use mortal wealth to buy influence, police departments, and politicians. Beatrice listened intently, her mind automatically shifting into the analytical gear she had honed over a decade as a senior bank manager. If they rely on the financial system, they have vulnerabilities. The global banking network leaves a digital footprint, no matter how many offshore accounts or shell companies they use. You can't move billions without triggering compliance algorithms. Valerius smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that made her pulse quicken. Exactly, and that is why I brought you. My generals understand war, Beatrice. They understand blood and territory. But you understand the labyrinth of mortal currency. While I was recovering in your home, relying on your mercy and raw meat to survive Bastion Montgomery, the acting head of the Coven was dismantling my financial infrastructure. Tonight, he intends to formalize his theft. The Gulf Stream touched down smoothly at Boeing Field, just as the Seattle skyline lit up against the gloom of the heavy rain clouds. A new motorcade organized by Valerius's loyalists who had infiltrated the city days prior was waiting. Their destination was the Columbia Center, the tallest skyscraper in the city. The Montgomerys had bought out the entire 76th floor, transforming an elite corporate boardroom into a sovereign diplomatic zone for the immortal elite of the West Coast. In the back of the armored Maybach, Valerius turned to Beatrice. She was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue Alexander McQueen gown the staff had provided. It featured a high, structured collar that felt almost like armor, while the heavy silk draped perfectly over her frame. Resting heavy and warm against her collarbone was the sovereign's tear, the massive ruby necklace that marked her as under the king's absolute protection. "Are you afraid?" Valerius asked softly. "I was afraid when my entire town turned against me," Beatrice answered, her voice steady, surprising even herself. "I was afraid when I had no heat and $50 to my name. Right now I just want to see the people who thought they could break you realize they failed." Valerius's eyes flared with a brilliant blood-red intensity. "Then let us show them the true cost of treason." They bypassed the public elevators, escorted by Gideon and 4 other heavily armed, impossibly fast guards, to a private express lift. The silence in the elevator was deafening, a coiled spring of violence waiting to be released. The elevator doors chimed and slid open to reveal the 76th floor. It was a sprawling, opulent space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic, storm-swept view of the Puget Sound. Dozens of impeccably dressed men and women stood around a massive, polished mahogany table. They held crystal flutes filled with a dark, viscous liquid that Beatrice instantly recognized by the metallic scent. At the head of the table stood Bastion Montgomery. He possessed the classical, statuesque beauty of all vampires, with ash-blonde hair and piercing, ice-blue eyes. He was in the middle of a grand, sweeping speech, holding a glass high. "And while the loss of King Valerius in the Bitterroot ambush is a tragedy that shakes our community, we must look to the future." Bastion's voice echoed off the glass walls, dripping with false sorrow. "We cannot allow the Northwest Territories to fall into chaos. Therefore, as of midnight tonight, Rainier Apex Capital will finalize the absorption of all Davenport holdings. I will assume the mantle of Alpha to ensure our prosperity and our secrecy." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Glasses were raised. "A beautiful eulogy, Bastion." A deep, resonant voice shattered the polite applause. "But entirely premature." The room froze. Valerius stepped out of the shadows of the antechamber into the harsh, modern lighting of the boardroom. Beatrice walked half a step behind his right shoulder, her posture perfectly straight, the sovereign's tear catching the light and practically glowing with a bloody fire. The reaction was instantaneous and chaotic. Crystal flutes shattered against the marble floor as several vampires physically recoiled, dropping to one knee in an involuntary display of submission to their true alpha. Others gasped, their fangs elongating in sheer panic. Bastion Montgomery went deathly pale, stepping back so fast he knocked his heavy leather chair to the floor. "Valerius, this is impossible. The Silver Ash, our scouts watched you fall. Your scouts are incompetent, And your poison was flawed, Valerius stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate the glass of the skyscraper. He began a slow, deliberate walk toward the head of the table. You thought to trap me in the form of a beast, to let the winter take me. You failed. Bastian's shock rapidly morphed into a cornered, desperate rage. He snapped his fingers, and 12 heavily armed mercenaries, the Crimson Guard dressed in tactical black gear with suppressed submachine guns, stepped out from the adjoining corridors, forming a wall between Bastian and the king. It doesn't matter, Bastian hissed, his composure cracking. You are too late, Valerius. Physical dominance means nothing in the modern world. You have no resources, no leverage. I triggered the final hostile takeover an hour ago. Every dime you have in the Swiss National Bank, every shell company tied to your name, every asset managed by Goldman Sachs, it's all frozen and currently routing into Rainier Apex accounts. You are a king of dirt and shadows. I am the future. He gestured to the massive digital display screen on the far wall, showing complex routing numbers and international wire transfers, with green progress bars rapidly approaching 100%. Valerius stopped walking. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely lethally amused. He turned his head slightly toward Beatrice. My dear, Valerius said smoothly, would you care to explain the reality of the situation to Mr. Montgomery? Beatrice stepped forward past the hulking form of Valerius's lead guard, Gideon. The vampires sneered at her, sensing her mortal heartbeat, but none dared move against the woman wearing the sovereign's tier. Mr. Montgomery, Beatrice began, her voice crisp and authoritative, the exact tone she used to use to dismantle fraudulent loan applications at the bank. Your hostile takeover relied on a sequence of staggered wire transfers through the Cayman Islands to avoid triggering the Federal Reserve's oversight algorithms. A very standard, somewhat lazy corporate embezzlement tactic. Bastian glared at her. Who is this human pet silencer? Valerius let out a feral sonic hiss that forced the front row of mercenaries to their knees, clutching their bleeding ears. She speaks, Valerius commanded, and you will listen? Beatrice pulled a sleek encrypted tablet from her clutch purse. During our flight from Portland, Valerius granted me access to his master financial mainframe. With my background in banking compliance, it took me exactly 14 minutes to identify your routing nodes. I didn't just block your transfers, Bastian. I used your own digital footprint against you. She tapped a single command on the tablet. The massive screen on the wall flickered violently. The green progress bars turned a glaring, angry red. Error. Access denied. Assets frozen. What did you do? Bastian demanded, his voice cracking. I rerouted the Davenport assets into a secure, decentralized ledger you cannot touch, Beatrice explained coldly. But more importantly, I took the liberty of exposing Rainier Apex Capital's internal ledgers to the SEC, the IRS, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I flagged your primary accounts for international terrorism funding and human trafficking. The room erupted into panicked shouting. Bastian scrambled for his own phone, staring at the screen in horror. As of 3 minutes ago, Beatrice continued, her eyes locked onto the man who had tried to murder her savior. The Department of Justice initiated an unoverridable freeze on every liquid asset you possess. Your credit lines are dead. Your shell companies are currently being raided by federal agents. You are bankrupt, Bastian. Beatrice looked at the 12 heavily armed mercenaries guarding Bastian. They were staring at their own tactical smartwatches, receiving frantic alerts from their Cayman accounts. And gentlemen, Beatrice addressed the guards, I happen to know your retainer fees are paid electronically at the end of the month. Your employer currently has a net worth of $0. Are you truly prepared to die fighting an Alpha King for a man who cannot pay you? The tension in the room was a physical weight. For 10 agonizing seconds, no one breathed. Then the captain of the Crimson Guard slowly lowered the barrel of his weapon. He unclipped his radio, threw it onto the mahogany table, and stepped aside. One by one, the rest of the mercenaries followed suit, parting like the Red Sea, to leave Bastion Montgomery completely exposed. "You miserable cowards!" Bastion shrieked, his fangs fully descending as his aristocratic facade shattered. He lunged forward, not at Valerius but at Beatrice, realizing she was the architect of his total ruin. He moved with supernatural speed, a blur of motion, aiming to tear her throat out. He never made it halfway. Valerius intercepted him with a speed that defied the laws of physics. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. Valerius caught Bastion by the throat, hoisting the struggling, kicking vampire 3 feet off the ground with a single hand. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the silent boardroom. "You plotted against my life," Valerius whispered, his crimson eyes burning like hellfire as he stared into Bastion's terrified face. "You attempted to steal my legacy, but your greatest mistake, Bastion, was lunging at the woman who holds my favor." Valerius didn't use a weapon. He drove his other hand directly into Bastion's chest, shattering his ribs, and violently extracted his heart. He dropped the lifeless, graying corpse onto the plush carpet, tossing the heart onto the mahogany table, where it left a thick, dark stain on the polished wood. The silence that followed was absolute. The entire Council of the Pacific Northwest, 30 of the wealthiest, most powerful immortals on the continent, dropped to their knees in unison, bowing their heads to the blood-soaked king. Valerius pulled a pristine silk handkerchief from his pocket, methodically wiping his hands. He looked down at the kneeling aristocrats. "Let this be the final lesson," Valerius commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The Davenport Empire is not ruled by corporate bureaucracy, nor is it subject to the whims of cowardly politicians. It is ruled by blood loyalty and absolute power." He turned to Beatrice, extending his hand. She took it, her fingers wrapping around his. His grip was firm, grounding her in the surreal, violent reality they had just conquered. "Rise," Valerius ordered the council. They scrambled to their feet, keeping their eyes averted. "You will return to your territories. You will dismantle whatever alliances you forged with the Montgomery faction. And you will understand this Beatrice is not a human pet. She is the mind that outmaneuvered your brightest schemers. She operates with my full authority. Disrespect her, challenge her, or attempt to undermine her, and I will not simply kill you. I will let her dismantle your entire existence first." The sheer poetic justice of the moment resonated deep within Beatrice's soul. She had spent the last year being told she was crazy, useless, and hysterical by a town of petty mortals. Now the most terrifying predators on Earth were bowing to her intellect. The hard karma she had desperately wished upon her enemies had manifested not through magic but through her own resilience and the power of the king who stood by her side. The cleanup was swift. Valerius's loyalists secured the building, disposing of Bastion's remains and seizing the remaining physical assets of the Montgomery Coven. The summit that was meant to be Valerius's eulogy had become the absolute consolidation of his empire. Later that night, back in the sprawling master suite of the Eyrie overlooking the Columbia River, the adrenaline finally began to fade. Beatrice stood by the massive glass windows, watching the moonlight reflect off the turbulent water below. Valerius stepped up behind her. The blood and violence of the boardroom had been washed away. He smelled of rain and cedar. He gently placed his hands on her shoulders, the warmth of his touch, a stark contrast to his usual cold nature. "You played a dangerous game tonight," Valerius murmured, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin of her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. "You exposed yourself to the wrath of the entire council." "I protected what is mine," Beatrice replied, leaning back against his solid chest. She turned her head to look at him. "You saved me from a life of misery in Oakhaven. I wasn't going to let a glorified hedge fund manager take you down." Valerius chuckled, a deep, rich sound that rumbled in his chest. "A hedge fund manager. If Bastion's ghost could hear you, it would weep." He turned her around so she was facing him. His crimson eyes were entirely devoid of malice, filled instead with a profound, consuming reverence. "The mortal who betrayed you, the Western heir, is currently sitting in a jail cell in Deschutes County, awaiting trial for the financial fraud we exposed," Valerius said softly. "Your sister is penniless. The town that shunned you has been entirely bought out by our front companies. Your mortal slate is wiped clean, Beatrice. The vengeance is complete." He reached up gently, tracing the line of her jaw. "But mortal lives are fleeting. They fade, they wither, and they are forgotten. You possess a mind and a spirit that deserves to conquer centuries." Beatrice's breath hitched. She knew what he was offering. It wasn't just a title or a share of his wealth. He was offering the ultimate transition. "Are you asking me to stay?" she whispered. "I am asking you to reign," Valerius corrected, his gaze burning into hers. "I am offering you eternity, Beatrice. Let my blood heal the final mortal wounds. Let us rule this empire together, not as king and savior, but as equals in the dark." She thought of the rusted cabin. She thought of the cold, lonely nights, wondering if she would ever feel safe again. Then she looked at the immortal king before her, the monster who had shown her more humanity and loyalty than any person she had ever known. She didn't hesitate. "Yes." Valerius's eyes flared. He pulled her flush against his body, his mouth descending on hers with a fierce, possessive hunger that ignited every nerve in her body. The kiss was a vow sealing a pact forged in blood, betrayal, and unbreakable loyalty. Morning sunlight pierced the thick canopy of Douglas firs, casting long, sharp shadows across the sleepy logging town of Oakhaven. For the first time in over a year, the heavy Pacific Northwest rain had ceased, leaving the air smelling of damp earth and crushed pine needles. Two matte black Maybach sedans glided soundlessly down Main Street, their tinted windows reflecting the modest, weathered storefronts. They moved with a predatory grace, entirely alien to the rusted pickup trucks and Subaru hatchbacks lining the curbs. Inside the lead vehicle, Beatrice sat in absolute stillness. She wore a tailored ivory-white Chanel power suit that contrasted sharply with the dark, plush leather interior of the luxury vehicle. Around her neck, hidden safely beneath her silk blouse, rested the sovereign's tear. It pulsed with a faint, warm energy, a constant reminder of the immortal king who had rewritten her destiny. When the motorcade pulled to a halt outside the local branch of U.S. Bank, the town seemed to hold its collective breath. This was the epicenter of Oakhaven's small-town politics, the financial gatekeeper that had gleefully locked Beatrice out at the behest of the Weston family. Stepping out into the crisp mountain air, Beatrice did not rush. She adjusted her cuffs, her movements precise and unbothered. Flanking her immediately were Gideon and another elite immortal operative, both dressed in immaculate dark charcoal suits. They scanned the perimeter with terrifying, unnatural efficiency. Pushing through the heavy glass doors of the bank, Beatrice stepped into a scene of absolute glorious chaos. Thomas Henderson, the regional branch manager who had publicly terminated her employment a year prior, was sweating profusely. His cheap, ill-fitting beige suit looked entirely out of place next to the three severe-looking corporate auditors from Deloitte standing in the center of the lobby. The tellers, women Beatrice had once shared lunch breaks and secrets with, were huddled behind the plexiglass counter, watching with wide, terrified eyes as the auditors slapped federal freeze notices onto the vault doors. "You cannot simply halt a commercial branch without a mandate from the Federal Reserve," Thomas stammered, his voice cracking as he waved a stack of printed emails at the lead auditor. "This branch manages the payroll for every logging outfit in Deschutes County. We are backed by the Western Development portfolio. If you don't remove these locks, I will have the sheriff arrest you for corporate sabotage." Western Development filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation 72 hours ago, Mr. Henderson, the lead auditor, replied, his tone as dry and unforgiving as desert sand. He didn't even bother to look up from his encrypted tablet. Their assets were seized by the Department of Justice. As for this physical building and its operational charter, it was absorbed at 4 a.m. this morning by Obsidian Vanguard Holdings. You no longer have any authority here. Thomas turned an ashen shade of grey. Obsidian Vanguard, I've never even heard of them. Who authorized this buyout? I did, Thomas. Beatrice's voice cut through the panicked murmur of the lobby like a gunshot. The sound of her heels clicking against the polished linoleum floor echoed in the sudden dead silence that followed. Thomas whipped around, his jaw dropping. He stared at the woman he had discarded into the wilderness. Beatrice looked nothing like the broken, weeping girl he remembered. She radiated an aura of absolute terrifying power, backed by two hulking men who looked ready to snap a spine at a moment's notice. Beatrice, Thomas gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. What? What are you doing here? You're trespassing security. The elderly security guard standing by the ATM alcove didn't move a muscle. He took one look at Gideon's dead, predatory stare and wisely decided to pretend he was a potted plant. I am afraid security works for me now, Thomas, Beatrice said smoothly, stopping mere feet from him. She crossed her arms, looking down at the sweating manager with a mixture of pity and cold satisfaction. I own this building. I own the asphalt parking lot outside. And as the primary shareholder of Obsidian Vanguard Holdings, I own this entire regional banking charter. Thomas looked like he had been struck by lightning. He looked from her pristine designer clothes to the auditors who were now quietly packing up their briefcases, deferring completely to Beatrice's presence. You bought the bank, Thomas whispered, his mind failing to comprehend the sheer scale of the financial violence that had just occurred. I bought the town, Beatrice corrected, her voice carrying a lethal softness. I spent the entire flight from Seattle reviewing your internal ledgers, Thomas. Your compliance rating is an absolute nightmare. You approved high-risk subprime commercial loans for the Western family with zero collateral purely to secure your invitation to their country club galas. Simultaneously, you aggressively foreclosed on independent farmers who missed a single payment. You used this institution as a weapon for the local elite. Please, you have to understand, Thomas begged, his hands trembling. The arrogant facade had completely shattered. I was just following orders. The Western family ran this county. If I didn't play ball, they would have ruined me just like they ruined... He stopped himself, realizing his fatal mistake too late. Just like they ruined me, Beatrice finished for him, a dark, chilling smile playing on her lips. Yes, they certainly tried, but the Western heir is currently sitting in a holding cell at the federal courthouse in Portland, facing 20 years for wire fraud and embezzlement. His empire is dust, and you, Thomas, are a liability to my new portfolio. The tellers behind the counter gasped. The realization of what was happening washed over the room. The pariah had returned, and she held the deed to their lives. You are officially terminated, effective immediately. Beatrice stated, her tone final and absolute. You have exactly 5 minutes to clear your personal belongings from the manager's office. If you attempt to access the mainframe or take any proprietary documents, my legal team at Pearson & Cole will ensure you spend the rest of your life buried in litigation. Thomas opened his mouth to argue, a desperate final plea forming on his lips. But Gideon shifted his weight, taking a single, deliberate step forward. The immortal operative didn't say a word, but the sheer, crushing promise of violence in his posture was enough. Thomas broke. He turned and practically sprinted toward his office, his head bowed in total defeat. Beatrice turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over the remaining bank staff. Several of her former friends looked down, unable to meet her eyes, thoroughly ashamed of how they had treated her when she was at her lowest. She didn't offer them a smile, nor did she offer them vengeance. They were simply mortals bending to the wind of whoever held the most power. She had evolved far beyond their petty, small-town judgments. Without another word, Beatrice turned and walked out of the bank. The morning air felt cleaner now. The heavy, suffocating weight of her past trauma, the betrayal, the humiliation, the freezing nights in the cabin, had been entirely excised. She had administered the hard karma they so deeply deserved, not with magic but by mastering the very system they had used to break her. As she approached the motorcade, the rear door of the Maybach swung open. Valerius Davenport sat in the shadows of the luxurious cabin, a crystal glass of dark-aged Scotch in his hand. His crimson eyes glowed with a fierce, possessive pride as he looked at her. Beatrice slid into the rich leather seat, sighing as the heavy door sealed shut instantly, cutting off the ambient noise of the mortal world. "Did the financial execution meet your standards?" Valerius asked, his deep, resonant voice wrapping around her like a velvet cloak. "It was everything I needed," Beatrice admitted, accepting a glass from him. She took a sip, the liquid burning a pleasant trail down her throat. "The ledger is balanced. I don't ever need to look back at this place again." Valerius reached out his cool, marble-like fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Mortals are obsessed with leaving a legacy in dirt and concrete. They build tiny empires that crumble in a century. You have proven that your mind is far too sharp to be wasted on such fleeting things." The Maybach's engine purred to life, the tires smoothly pulling away from the curb. They drove past the rusted sign, welcoming visitors to Oakhaven, leaving the town to its inevitable collapse. "The transition chamber at the Eyrie has been prepared," Valerius murmured, his gaze darkening with an ancient consuming hunger. "Tonight, when the sun dips below the Cascade Mountains, the final mortal chains will be broken. You will no longer age. You will no longer fear the cold. You will rule the shadows by my side." Beatrice leaned her head against his solid shoulder, listening to the steady, unnatural stillness of his chest. She had found a broken creature bleeding on her porch, and in nursing him back to health, she had found her true equal. "Take me home, Valerius," Beatrice whispered, watching the sunlit forest blur past the tinted window. "Let the night begin." Thank you so much for diving into the shadows with us in this epic tale of betrayal, billionaire, vampire kings, and the ultimate hard karma. If Beatrice's rise from a rejected outcast to the untouchable queen of the Pacific Northwest kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love dark romance, poetic justice, and supernatural drama. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling multi-part audio drama. What would you do if a massive bat crashed on your porch? Let us know in the comments below.